Good evening. Welcome to our viewers. Uh, as you know, the Guyana Dialogue is sponsored by a group of Guyanese based in the United States, Canada, the UK, the Caribbean, and in Guyana. Funding for this project is by well-known Guyanese businessman and philanthropist, Mr. Dave Narine of Dave Imports. With us today, we have well-known Guyanese, one of the rising stars in the academic world, Mr. J.C. Bhagwandin, who will go deeper into explaining the level and scope of measures that the government has introduced to ease the cost of living pressure on Guyanese. Recent there has been a lot of articles and letters written asking the government to do much more than it is doing. Sometimes you get the impression that they feel that the government is not doing enough. So Mr. Bhagwandin will enlighten us. He will go through and actually give us some figures so that people can get an idea of the magnitude of the help that the government has helped so far. And we may probably make some suggestions what the government can do in future to mitigate the problem. Welcome to Mr. Joel Bhagwandin. As you know, he's the CEO of Spherex Professional Services in Guyana, and he's been writing almost every day to the press, explaining the government position. He's so, Mr. Bhagwandin, we are very happy to have you. Our other panelists are in this post tonight. Two of them are under the weather, and we wish them a speedy recovery. And one has an urgent family commitment today. So I will be the only one who will be with you, but that doesn't detract at all from the your presentation. So before we start, I would like you to just give your general comment on the government plan to beautify Georgetown, to make it, to restore back the concept of Garden City.
All right. Good evening, Dr. Tara,
Yeah,
and
go ahead.
good evening to you, and good evening to the viewers. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend to spend the next hour having engaging in these discussions, particularly for the diaspora audience. Uh, See, you've asked for my comment on my general comment in terms of the beautification projects in Georgetown, but I would go a little bit further to say not just Georgetown, but across the country. And if I may, I would like to frame that comment from a personal experience. I as a family person, I'm a family. I can safely say I'm a family man. I have three children, and you know, just 5 years ago, just 5 years ago, there were limited places, limited things to do, limited places you could take your family to engage in recreational activities, particularly for the children. And when we look across the country, on the West Coast, for example, you now have several modern, healthy play parks or recreational facilities where you can take your entire family, the children can go and play. And I have taken my family, I'm living all the way on the East Coast. And now with the bridge, now that we have the new bridge, the traveling time is remarkable. Traveling time on weekends is remarkable to go to all the way on the West Coast, which just a few years ago, it was considerably longer. I can now take my children for a drive across the river to have a good evening, playful evening with them in the recreational park on the West Coast. There are several of them coming to Georgetown. the beautification projects to enhance the city. Um, we have the resources to do it, and these things are important in terms of enhancing the society, elevating the society within which we exist, enhancing the value of these infrastructure and preserving the value of these infrastructure, which has an intangible value that not only attracts tourism to the country or creating these facilities and infrastructure and sightseeing that tourists can come to our country and they have something to do, they have something to learn, but it's a preservation of our own history as well in terms of educational purposes for our children. A lot of us, don't are now well read, don't know much of our history, and so these investments in the beautification, it's not just beautification per se or spending money on beautification, but these have tremendous value from a multidimensional within a multidimensional framework in terms of tourism, in terms of added value to a society, in terms of elevating the status of a society, and it also adds, I would say, finally, as Guyanese, it lends to that sense of pride. It lends to that sense of identity, you know, um, especially since most Guyanese today have the opportunity and the privilege to travel to other countries. And when you travel to other countries, you are exposed to this kind of modern environment, modern infrastructure, modern facilities. And to see these investments being made in our own country with the aim of building our society and building our people. These are these are remarkable contributions to our society, and in terms of making the country a better, safer, and a more beautiful place.
Yeah, one of the problems we have is that there was a recent Dr. Devanand Bhagwan went to Guyana recently. He spent about 3 weeks. And what he noticed, he was very impressed with the development and everything that's taking place in Guyana. But he saw disposal of garbage, waste management is a huge problem there. And he was mentioning about the litter that is found everywhere when people got weddings, etc. Do you think that the government is on track to handle this effectively and to set up what we call these machines to recycle bottles and glasses, etc.?
I think it is a sore problem in Guyana for a long time, and in terms of whether the government is committed and equipped to deal with it in that manner, I think they are. Only recently, just a few nights ago, I was at a corporate function, the Oil and Gas Energy Chamber, and the conversation came up about the very topic the garbage situation across the country. Um, we've seen the efforts that the government is making in terms of cleaning up the city, in terms of um, implementing measures, putting more bins across the country. It's also a lifestyle thing, and us as a people taking responsibility. But that aside, it, outside of the lifestyle and the garbage situation at hand, one of the solution is, as you have hinted or suggested, is to have these waste to energy, is to look at waste to energy facilities, investment in a waste to energy plant, for example, which I think would go a far way in terms of solving some of these garbage issues, because it's not only the garbage within the society and the roadways and the drain, but also the dump sites and where they're situated. Like I, um, when you go along the East Bank area there, towards Prospect and so on. All the new development, the new lands open up there with the new road network along there. There is a dump site there, and you have residential development taking place, commercial development taking place. And when you drive past that area, if you're going to invest in a residential community, then that dump site would have to move. It's not going to be environmentally friendly for that area. Now, I'm certain that the government is taking all of this into account. And for me, I would advocate strongly for investment in waste to energy plans, and we'd have to look. We would have to revisit. It's something we would have to revisit. And I say that because I am aware that several years ago this was being explored by some private investors when I was at a private sector commission. But the pre-feasibility study back then suggests that we do not have sufficient amount of garbage to supply a waste to energy plant. It would mean that you'd have to import garbage, which is not something that desirable. You don't want to import garbage to run a waste to energy plant. So you want, if the environment is producing um, sufficient amount of garbage that can support the commercial viability of such an investment, then it's something that we'd have to look at as a solution in the long term.
Mhm. Okay. There's also the added, like these derelict vehicles that are parked alongside the roads in many areas is really an eyesore, and that is something they have to.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge, and it's a big challenge for the government. The vice president has been talking about this um, on many press conferences. He's made reference to this.
I
And
I
on the
think.
East Coast, for instance, they we're expanding the roadways, the road network into 4 lane, but because of limited space, vehicles are parked on one side, occupying an entire lane. So what is meant to be a 2 lane road going in one direction becomes a 1 lane, defeating the purpose of the investment. So these are infrastructural challenges
Yeah,
that the government will have to overcome, and
I
find innovative solutions for them,
mhm.
which is going to take
I,
some time.
I was really referring to the vehicles that are scrapped, the derelict vehicle that they have on the roadside park, which is nice. I'm not speaking about the active vehicles that are working, those that they condemn and
Yeah,
not
that too,
used.
that too is proving to be a hindrance in terms of right here where I live
Mhm.
in Gurup. We
Yeah.
have quite a few in the streets. You
All,
barely have space to move around.
okay. All right. Let's go back. Go now to the main subject. I know you have written extensively on the various measures that the government has implemented to ease the cost of living pressures in Guyana to improve people's quality of life. You have gone way back to when they removed 200 new taxes and fees that the PNC government has imposed. So, can you please give us a brief run through of all these measures? But if you can put a figure, that will mean a lot to people. When you tell them the government do A, B, C, D, the next thing they want to know how much. And once they know how much, they will get a better appreciation because I don't think they have an idea of the magnitude of help that the government has been giving them. So, can you please proceed?
So, uh, let me start with the figures first, and then I'll elaborate. I've done the assessment, and if we're to quantify all of the measures that the government, fiscal measures and programs and so on, relief programs, that is, that the government has implemented and maintained on a recurring basis year after year since 2020, it would run up to upwards of $500 billion or half a trillion dollars. in Guyana dollar terms, and that's a conservative estimate. Um, that's a conservative estimate. It's going to run up to upwards of $500 billion. If we divide that by the number of households, the total number of households, if we have 220,000 households, that works out to about 2.3, approximately $2.3 million per household per annum. We can say that's equivalent to a cash grant of 2.3 million per household per annum, because these measures are effectively fiscal measures that have direct and indirect impact on household um, finances. Now, in terms of elaborating on that, that's the high level, the aggregated figures, and putting that into perspective. Often one of the measure that I believe is has been understated over the years. It's a measure that the government has implemented a long time ago in 2013, something called a mortgage interest relief. Now, that mortgage interest relief program, we understand what that mortgage interest relief program really is. It is for first time homeowners who have mortgages with the bank up to 30 million, and the ceiling have been also the government has also increased that ceiling over the years. It was not 30 million from the beginning. It started off lower than 30 million, and then it's now currently at 30 million. On a $30 million loan, you're talking about $900,000 in interest expense per annum. On a say $10 million loan, you're talking about maybe 300,000 interest expense per annum per household. Now that relief is a cash relief. The interest expense that you pay when you pay a mortgage, when you file your tax return in April of every year, you apply for the tax, you apply for the mortgage interest relief, and the tax authority writes a check and give you for that amount. They refund 100% of your interest expense for loans up to $30 million. Now that means that policy, which is understated, it effectively means it's a policy that allows Guyanese homeowners to access interest-free loans for their home. It's interest-free because you're getting back all the interest. So there is a fiscal policy in which the government has provided an incentive by waiving the taxes on the interest earned for the banks so that they could lower the interest rate. So the interest rate on a home mortgage is between 3 to 6% or 4 to 6%, way below the market rate. The market average rate on credit is, or the prime, if we use the prime lending rate, it's about 11%. So for you to access a home loan at 5% or 4%, that's a concession. That's not the market rate. So you have cheap cost of financing for home loans, and then through the mortgage interest relief program, you are refunded 100% of the interest expense you pay on the loan. So effectively, you're talking this is an interest-free home loan you're having, and this has been in place since 2013. This is a policy that has been in place since 2013. Another measure is, well, we have the 200 taxes, and we've oftentimes elaborated what those 200 taxes constitute. Those 200 taxes alone translate to about $60 billion, 60 to $70 billion annually. When they were effected, that means extraction of an extra 60, $70 billion from households, a reduction in disposable income. The reversal of those taxes means the restoration of 60 odd billion dollars in disposable income by that one measure alone. Then we had when fuel prices doubled, when oil prices doubled in the post-COVID period, when it jumped from $50 to nearly $100. That was a double-edged sword. And so what the government sought to do, there's a 50% excise tax on fuel imports. At that time, our fuel import bill was about 500 million US dollars. Today, it's hovering over a billion US dollars, our fuel import bill. So from 50% to 0%, they've removed the excise taxes. And there was, in fact, a study that was done that recently that concluded that Guyana has the lowest cost of fuel in the Caribbean, in the region. And the reason for that is because of that very policy, the reduction of that excise tax of 50% to 0%. That is another, at today's value of fuel imports, that's going to run up to maybe close to 40 or $50 billion annually in relief to the people, in relief in terms of adding to disposable income, adding to disposable household income. Now, before I go on and list several others, an important point to note is that following the 2020 period, following the post-COVID, the country was shut down almost for a year or more than a year. Uh, in 2021, the government then decided to gradually reopen the economy. And so the IMF, when they come to do their annual assessment, the Article 4 report, the 2021, the 2022, when they came in 2022, remember all these measures were instituted from the 2020 budget, continued and expanded on in the 2021 budget. By the first quarter of 2022, we were already fully reopened. The economy was fully reopened, and we started to advance the development agenda back then rapidly, rebuilding the non-oil sectors, agriculture, and so on. And so the IMF, in their 2022 report, recommended to the government that the government should roll back some of those subsidies. And we're talking about the excise tax, for example, and a whole string of others, the cash relief and so on, cash grants and so on. The IMF recommended to roll back those subsidies because the economy was fully reopened, and we started to progress quite rapidly. Now imagine if the government had listened to the IMF's recommendation and actually implemented the IMF recommendation. The government was subsidizing and continue to subsidize today electricity cost. Because if you look at the financial statements of GPL, they're in a loss making position, and that is because the cost of production has increased exponentially because of the cost of fuel prices and of course the demand. And so they have not been in a break-even position for since COVID. And so that cost has been subsidized by the government, which again is running into in excess of $30 billion annually to keep electricity prices to the consumer constant. Now, if the government had listened to the IMF recommendation to roll back those subsidies, it means that each household would have had an added burden of $2.3 million per household. Rather than a $2.3 million in subsidy, or effectively a $2.3 million per household, it increased disposable income, or if you use the term, it's equivalent to a cash grant. If those subsidies and those policies were rolled back according to the IMF's recommendation, then it's going to be a $2.3 million burden Households would have to find an extra $2.3 million to be able to contend with rising prices in terms of meeting their daily requirements. So I'll pause there. I'll pause there for that. But I think I made a point on the relief measures.
Yeah, I think that, however, what the government does is great, but as I mentioned before, some people believe that it's still not enough. I mean, they're saying that the cost of certain products are so high. I was in Guyana recently. I visited a few markets, and the price of vegetable was okay, but there's prices of things like fish and shrimps, seafood are very, very expensive, and it's very hard for a person who earns, say, less than a household who earn less than 20 US per day, really to purchase those things. So they continue. I don't know what's the inflation rate now in Guyana is, but I don't know what basket of items they use to calculate the inflation rate. But it would seem that everywhere you go, if you go to a restaurant, certain category of people cannot go there because the food is too expensive. So those are the things they're picking on. I don't know what validity that has, but maybe you have some thoughts on that if you can give some quick ideas.
If you disaggregate the consumer price index and look at the sub indices, while the overall inflation rate is in the low single digit, the food category, food prices account for the highest rate of inflation within that basket. And so it is true that food prices have been on the rise. And that is largely on account of several factors, particularly particularly market forces right here in Guyana, demand and supply. So when you have, and this is because this is on account of increased disposable income. If you look at it is because of higher disposable income, the increase in wages, real wages, the rise in real wages, you have this high rate of inflation. If you look at consumption expenditure, aggregate consumption expenditure, you look at it for a time over a time horizon of say the last 10, 15 years, consumption expenditure accounted for maybe less than 10% of GDP. You look at those numbers now, consumption expenditure accounts for nearly 20% of GDP. 20% of GDP. So we have, if you look at the deposits, if you look at another indicator, the savings rate in the banking sector, you would find that we have a very high savings is almost hitting the $1 trillion mark. The total assets in the banking sector hitting the $1 trillion mark. The loan to deposit ratio in the banking sector is among the lowest globally, not only regionally but globally. Our loan to deposit ratio is 40%. Now the reason why, although you have, it is reported that we have increase in private sector credit, in right. Although we having those reports, the reason why we still have excess liquidity in the banking sector, and the reason why we still have, despite the growth in credit reported, why we still have a low loan to deposit ratio is because the rate of savings, the rate of the growth in savings in the banking sector is faster, is growing at a faster rate than the rate of growth in credit. That is consistent with the consumption to GDP ratio that we've seen and how that equation has moved from 8% to GDP to over 20% of GDP. So that in of itself is driving the inflation. We're spending 20%, more than 20% on consumption, and that is inflationary. That is inflationary because wages keep increasing. And so that is why we have to manage these things. We have to manage, we have to be careful in terms of the administration of fiscal policies, how quickly we ramp up wages. Because if we continue to have substantial increases in wage, if we continue to have rapid wages inflation, then we're going to have runaway inflation in food prices too. So that has to be controlled because of demand and supply forces. It has to be controlled while we invest in the supply side to bring down prices, to stabilize prices in a in a market economy. It's supply and demand of goods. If you have high wages, if you have high disposable income, you're going to have high consumption. And if your supply is not meeting that demand, you will have high food prices. And so, wages, the rate of increase in wages and income in aggregate income has to be controlled, has to be managed, while we invest on the supply side to ramp up the supply side of the food chain in terms of production. So, you invest, that is why the investment in infrastructure is important. The investment in drainage and irrigation, the investment in road infrastructure, road network, opening up new land for commercial activities, new land for agriculture production, new land for investment, new land, the gas to energy to bring cheaper energy so that we can have an industrialized, so that we can have an economy powered by a new level of industrialization so that we can produce value added. So those investments in the infrastructure side that are geared towards creating new growth poles, creating new investment opportunities on the production side, on the supply side, those are important to bring prices, food prices in particular, down to stabilize or to control it.
Mhm.
That's
All
how
right.
free market systems work.
Right. Thank you. We can take a short break now and then we'll come back. Asif? Okay, we're back. I just want to draw your attention to there was an article in this week paper where one of the writers was contending he allegedly quote from an IDB report that the poverty rate in Guyana, as per IDB, was 58%. I believe you saw that article. I don't know what period the IDB report was referring to. He didn't state that. So we need some clarification there. There is no way where Guyana poverty rate can be 58%. And of course, they use the new rates of $6.85 per person per day. That's what the World Bank have for middle income, upper income country. Um, my own view is that I've been speaking to several business people in Guyana, and they said there is job, there is opportunity for everybody who wants to take it. But there are quite a lot of, especially young people, who doesn't seem to want to work. They want to depend on handout or something like that. But businessmen have challenged them to come on board. They can train them and get them set up for a good job, etc. Now, I think based on some deductions that I have made, that the poverty rate will be far less than 15%. And within the next couple of years, I think it will be less than 10%. We'll move into single digits. So your thoughts on that? I don't know how they arrive at 58%. Even in 2019, the World Bank gave a figure of 48%. So are you?
So
I don't know if you study this letter or the IDB report that they're referring to.
I've studied these reports. I've studied these reports, and we have to understand, and the average non-technical Guyanese or non-technical person gotta understand how these reports are constructed. Now, often the the, the persons who cite these reports, who cite these rates, they don't understand how these reports are constructed, but they cite these rates because it's convenient to situate it within a certain narrative that carries a certain political connotation or a certain political agenda. But if one were to really study and understand these reports, you look at the methodology. These poverty rates that the IDB and the World Bank they come up with, these are not based on any actual poverty studies, you know. These are not studies done. The last poverty study that was done in Guyana was done since in the 80s. Since in the 80s, we haven't had another poverty study in this country. These reports, these poverty rates, these are estimates that are derived by way of a theoretical model, a statistical model, whereby they use a very small sample size of data, which is dated, a very small, less than a percent of the house of the population, very small sample size. The reports the reports themselves lack transparency on the demographic of that sample size. So you really don't know if this sample size, while it is so small, it is a minuscule sample size, whether it covers geography, whether it covers all the different facets, all the different facets of the social economy and socio-economic realities and context. The data doesn't tell you that. So these reports lack transparency in that regard. But more importantly, these are statistical models. These are statistical models that are assumption driven, not based on actual data or an actual study, that is benchmarked to other standardized studies globally, and these rates are then benchmarked to other countries for comparability. And so the entire thing is very theoretical. It's not real. It's not real. For you to really come up with what is the actual rate of poverty, you have to do a study, and there are different methodologies in which you measure poverty. And so we haven't done a study since in the 80s, since in the late 80s or mid 80s. The
Yeah.
Bureau of Statistics in Guyana, I saw them advertise a few weeks ago a countrywide economic survey. Now, that is a study. That study, that data that they would gather nationwide from that economic survey is essentially a poverty study. They're gathering data for a poverty study, and that will give us the true picture, the true, actual, real picture on the rate of poverty. Now, having said that, like you, I have done my own work as well based on my own data sets and my own assumptions and my own model, and I have come up with a rate, an estimate of around the same thing, less than 20%, less than 20%.
Could they, this IDB report, was they took a sample that is heavily biased towards the Amerindian community because they have had the highest poverty rates in the country. I was wondering, I didn't see the methodology, or else I would able to offer some suggestions about that. But if they
It's
do a
difficult to say.
sample,
The reports are not transparent on the sample, um, the sample variables and components of those sample. It's not transparent.
but there is enough data. I mean, I traveled throughout the country. The only place I didn't go was at Sikbo Coast. And most people are earning a decent wage now, um, probably more than 20, at least more than 20 US per day. Um, and the World Bank threshold for poverty is 685 per individual. The average household is about 3 point something. I don't know what the new census will indicate, but it's 3618. So if you earn 25 US a day, you're covered by the World Bank definition of poverty. But poverty is much more than money. People are earning less than that, but they don't
There,
feel they're deprived. They don't feel they're in a poverty situation. Poverty has to be a state of feelings too. It's got a psychological component of it. But I mean, the qualitative data are very compelling. How many people now are unemployed? I was told by the last Minister of Labor is less than 5%. I don't know if that is correct, but that's what he said. There has been no manpower study, labor study. I think the last one was done in 2021 or something like that. You may probably know better than that.
yeah, it's
But the,
it's it's dated, and you're quite right. There are different, as I mentioned, there are different methodologies to measure poverty. The popular methodology used is the monetary methodology, whereby you use the base rate, um, the universal base rate, to measure poverty. But another approach to measuring poverty, which I would prefer, is the multidimensional approach, which measures several other things. For example, access to healthcare, access to electricity, access to potable water, and those type of stuff. So if you the different methodologies of measuring poverty that we use would give you different results because they measure different things, they have different definition of poverty, but often the one when people what the one that occupies our mind when we speak of poverty, we're thinking income and wages, but different approaches towards um, assessing poverty.
yeah, and I think when they construct this $6.85 per individual per day, US, I think they took into consideration. access to healthcare, to education, some basic food items. They combine it and they put a value to it. Um, but uh, I'm not sure. I'm just speculating here. I think that might have been the attention, how they arrive at this figure. Because if they don't do that, if a person get free health care, free education, and now they get children will get a payment for textbook free and travel free and all these other services free. I mean, how you quantify that in a system where you use money as the medium to make comparisons?
Right, that's why I'm saying to you that there are different approaches, different methodologies. The common methodology that the World Bank uses, it's the monetary measurement, and their studies that they do are premised on a statistical model that is largely assumption driven, not premised on any actual study or taking into account. The last time I look at these reports, they are not they do not account for the multidimensional elements, the access to healthcare and access to education and electricity and that type of stuff.
I mean, if there are any poverty stricken areas or areas that have high rates of poverty, those will theoretically be in the Amerindian areas, uh, probably Region 1, Region 7, Region 9. But
And other
their
rural areas
condition,
as well. Other you have poverty in other rural communities
yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
well, they have in the coastal belt like Plastic City and Pretty Hope, and they got certain parts of other. But what I'm saying is that the pockets of poverty are not there as they used to be years ago. People have gone, have improved themselves, they have elevated themselves, and these pockets have narrowed considerably, given the fact that there is a high level of employment now, and you have other types of grant and relief. So I don't know why they still harp on this poverty thing. Poverty, um, well, because they always say that one of the main functions of economic growth is to eliminate poverty. But poverty is never going to be eliminated in any country. America is the richest country in the world, and it has a poverty rate of 11%. In New York City, is 19%. And they have been existing for centuries. So we will have a certain level of poverty. People, no matter what you do, you'll have them, and that cannot be explained by economic reason alone, but psychological and philosophical reasons. Some people may just simply do not want to work, etc. Coming back to our discussion on the grants that the government is giving out now, the government announced that they will make some kind of a grant before Christmas, a one-off grant. It will be in excess of 100,000, but they didn't say how much. Some people have speculated 200,000, but I think the vice president has questioned that. He don't know where the 200,000 came up from. But it's very nice that they have given. This is something I have written about. The handicapped had deserved a better grant that they were getting. Now the government is giving them a 50,000 one-off, which is wonderful, and they will increase their monthly allowance, I think, to 40,000 or something like that. So this is a population that really need help. Those people who are mentally and physically challenged. So your thoughts on, but I am a bit I'm not too excited about this continuation of grants. Grants must be given for specific reasons, with specific purpose. In other words, they must be conditional. Because if you continue to give off one-off grants, you're developing a, a syndrome there, a dependency syndrome. And that is what happened in places like America, because people depend on this now and they don't want to work. Able-bodied body now, they are trying to force them out to go and work. But that is what happens when you give people too much benefits and grants, etc. So they got to be careful. That's my view, and I believe you can give people, help them out, to give them grants if they want to start a house, buy a plot of land, and these things are compelling reasons, but not to give out like that.
The,
What are your thoughts?
I'm glad you mentioned about the. You see, the piece that I wrote was not an exhaustive list. And you've mentioned another important one about the housing. There is a grant program for housing as well, in addition to all the other things I mentioned about mortgage interest relief. There is a subsidy for home builders, and the government has committed towards increasing that subsidy in their new mandate in this term. I have no doubt that they're going to deliver on that. Now, in terms of the question of the cash grant, I it's a debatable subject whether whether a government should continue issuing cash grants. That's a perpetual debate in a society like ours. But if we look at it from the policy position of the government, the policy position of the government is they've implemented this cash grant. It was the one-off cash grant from 18 years and over was introduced in 2024. Then it continued in 2025. Then on the election campaign and in their manifesto, they've committed to making this cash grant, the one-off cash grant, into an annual cash grant. And there is a big debate now, or a big concern by a small section of the political circle on the opposition side, that the government said they're going to pay this cash grant before Christmas. Now, I can't recall that the government said that they're going to pay the cash grant before Christmas. And the clip that I see that they're playing with the president, what he simply says is, "You're going to have a nice Christmas." And I think we are all are going to have a nice Christmas. He made no explicit commitment that you're going to have the cash grant before Christmas or for Christmas. Now, we could put all kinds of interpretation to that. But when we come down to, if you look at it in a more serious and objective manner and a practical manner, election was held when in September, correct?
Yeah,
September was the election.
1st of September.
Election was held in September. By the time the cabinet was sworn in, the president was sworn in, we had some recounts. So they were not the 5 month protracted period as in 2020, but we had a couple of weeks by the time the government was fully sworn in. I can't remember by when. By was that towards the end of September or going on
A
to
couple of
October?
weeks ago, couple of
Couple
weeks
of weeks.
ago.
They're a couple of weeks apart. By the time the cabinet was fully sworn in and then Parliament was reconvened, the government priority was to immediately start the preparation and planning, or continue preparation and planning with a renewed mandate, a more aggressive mandate, a more ambitious mandate for budget 2026, which is which is going to be tabled in the National Assembly in January. So the entire government apparatus is preoccupied with budget preparation. And this is not the 2025 budget. This is a very, very aggressive agenda for this next 5 years. To give you a simple example, in the last 5 years, the government has, when they introduced this turnkey home, from distributing house lots and giving people, creating that incentive for them to be able to go and access loans and build their own homes. The government is creating more and more options for the people, catering for all types of different situations that people are in. For example, busy professionals would not have time to go and build a house from scratch. They prefer to buy a turnkey home. And so the government introduced a turnkey home program for low income young professionals. And so they have been building homes, they've been building housing units of various sizes, various price points, price ranges, for the different needs of the market, the population. And if we quantify that, they've been building less than 1,000 housing units per year. Less than 1,000 housing units per year. In this term, they want to do 40,000 houses. Build, not land, houses, housing units. That means you gotta build about 8,000 houses a year, from less than 1,000 to 8,000. So this is a serious agenda. And so one has to understand and appreciate that this is a serious agenda. This 2026 is going to be a very, very large and significant budget to drive a development agenda 8 times or 10 times far greater than what was obtained in the 2020-2025 period. If we thought 2020 coming 2020, if we thought 2020 and 2025 was aggressive, this term, based on the agenda, is 10 times more aggressive, 20 times more ambitious than the last term. So when one just think, oh, well, we said a cash grant. You don't just go and pay out the cash grant. The cash grant was not provided for a new 2025 cash grant was not provided for in 2025 budget. The cash grant that was provided for in the 2025 budget was the continuation of the last year cash grant, which is about 60 billion. So 30 billion was appropriated in 24, so another 30 billion was appropriated in 2025. That's the same cash grant from 24, continue roll over into 2025. There was no new provision for another cash grant in 2025. So that means you would have to appropriate that money, which was not appropriated in this budget. So that means the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act does allow for expenditure to be drawn from the contingency fund, and then you get it approved in a supplementary. But it doesn't make any sense October, at this time in the year, October, November, now we're in December, to draw from the contingency and then go for a supplementary approval before the end of the year, when you would not, it is unlikely that you would distribute all of that money before the end of the year, which you're going to have to put back to the consolidated fund if it's not distributed. So practically, given the priority and the focus of the government to prepare for the 2026 budget, given the timing, and given the accountability and fiscal procedures, practically, I don't see that happening. If one were to do that, then the government would then have to engage in a reckless thing of breaching the fiscal procedures and accountability procedures. So that's my explanation and my reasoning of it when I look at it from that perspective. So, that being said, I am 100% certain that It will be provided for in the 2026 budget, and it will be paid as the government promised
Mm.
or committed in the 2026, in the
Okay.
fiscal year 2026.
All right. Based on what you have said, the massive work that they are projecting in the next budget, that would suggest that this budget might be at least 20% greater than last year's budget. I'm just um, a thought there. Now, we have come to the end of our program, and I would like you to make your closing remarks. Once again, I apologize to our other panelists who are under the weather, and we wish them speedy recovery. And over to you with your closing
Well,
remarks.
my closing remark is simple. It's always a pleasure to sit and have these discussions on these topical national issues in Guyana for the diaspora audience. And I always enjoy doing this. So I just want to say thank you for the opportunity for
No,
doing so once again.
yeah, well, we thank you very much for sharing us with your vast wealth of education, of knowledge in the economics and fiscal area. And most of the Guyanese, as you rightly said, they don't go in depth to understand how figures and how methodologies are worked out to arrive at certain conclusions. So it's you and others who have been trained in that area can help simplify it for the audience to understand. And we thank you very much. Continue with the great works, and we'll meet again next Thursday on another program of the Guyana Dialogue, which is sponsored and funded by Dave Narayan from Dave Import. So thank our listeners and wish you have a wonderful weekend. God bless. Thank you, JC. Thank you, Asif, and all the best to everyone.